Thank you so much for having me here, and I really appreciate all of you giving up your lunch hour to hear about human trafficking. So I know probably not everyone will be able to see, but I'll have a presentation up here, and I'll try to kind of describe to you what's on the slides. For those of you in the front rows, can you see decently? Okay, great. And I'll also email some materials to Maria to send out to y'all after the fact. What is human trafficking? Oh, well, before I start, I want this to be as interactive as possible. I think it's a lot more interesting if it's not just me talking the whole time. So encourage you to ask questions at any point. You can, share your own experiences, and please, shout out answers to questions, whatever. So what is human trafficking? Does anyone kind of know a good definition? Yep.
Can I say, well, I want to say that it's when someone kidnaps a person, young or towards older, and they end up using them for prostitution and a bunch of other stuff.
Okay. Any other answers? Yep.
Taking someone and holding them against their will and then trading them for something else.
Okay.
In a business transaction.
Yeah. These are all really good answers. Anyone want to add any more?
Using a human as a commodity
Mm-hmm.
in any kind of way.
Yeah, I really like that wording of human as a commodity. So there are two main types of human trafficking. Sex trafficking and labor trafficking. What have you heard more about?
Sex trafficking.
Right. Do you think there are more sex trafficking victims or more labor trafficking victims?
Labor.
Yeah. You probably also realized by me asking you that question, it's not the one that you heard more about, right? But the economy, the sex trafficking economy is actually a lot larger, which is just an interesting note. So this is the TVPA, Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And this was kind of the beginning of anyone even using this word, trafficking. So this was passed in 2000, I believe. So the term trafficking has really only existed for about 20 years. You also probably feel like there's more and more trafficking happening all the time. That may be true, but considering that we didn't even have a word for it until the past 20 years, it's really difficult to know. And undoubtedly, trafficking has always been occurring, right? Texas and Washington were the first two states to write a state law that addressed trafficking. And our law uses three elements: force, fraud, and coercion. So kidnapping someone and holding them against their will, what would that involve of those three elements? Force, right? In your example, you were also probably mostly referring to force, right?
Yeah, I was just referring to not only what she was saying,
Mm-hmm.
but like in the workforce and stuff.
Yeah.
Like sometimes people think that they're going to be a nanny, but
Mm-hmm.
they're forced to work as a nanny. They don't ever, they're held against their will.
Yeah, that's a really, really great example. I have some examples here of force, so physical beating, sexual violence, deprivation of food, water, shelter, your basic needs, right? Confinement, kidnapping, transportation against your will, those sorts of things. And that's what people almost always think of when they think of trafficking. A lot of people think of the movie Taken, right? But fraud and coercion are two other elements that can be present and can also those elements are enough on their own to establish a case of trafficking. So fraud is going to be something, like you said, you promise one type of employment, and then when the person is kind of there and ready to do that work, they're actually faced with a different type of employment. Also, I think lying about debt structure, for instance. So I'm going to do this for you for free. I'm going to, let's say, pay for your visa for you to come to America and work for me. And then once you get here, oh, actually, you owe me money. where did I put in writing that I was paying for this? You're going to have to pay me back doing XYZ. Coercion, those are threats, debt bondage, psychological abuse. So debt bondage, maybe it doesn't even involve fraud, but you kind of, a loan shark is getting someone into a really, really difficult situation that doesn't follow the legal channels of how you would loan someone money, and then they are using that debt to convince them to do a bunch of things that they don't want to do. As I said, threatening someone with violence, threatening their family with violence, threatening with someone with deportation, or to report them to immigration, for instance. And I'll kind of give some examples really quickly of different instances of trafficking. So your example of a nanny, that is actually a real case in Houston, that someone was brought over from another country to work as a nanny, and then she was indeed the nanny, but she didn't have a place to sleep of her own. They made her, the only milk she could have was the milk that was left over in the kids' cereal bowls after they finished eating. They took her passports and all of her papers and put them in a safe, and she didn't have access to it. She didn't have freedom of movement. She wasn't receiving any of her money. And so a neighbor actually had been to a trafficking presentation, and when the nanny was outside for a very brief period of time, kind of noticed how disheveled and just that some things seemed off, and eventually worked with some local organizations to get this nanny to safety. Fun fact, because I met the people who basically rescued her, they still live beside the her traffickers that they had to pay out back wages, but they did not actually spend any time in jail. So the people who essentially turned them in and the traffickers continue to be neighbors, which is pretty awkward, to say the least. What is the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling?
Smuggling is done with the people who are being transported want to do so, versus the trafficking where, again, it is done with malicious intent.
Right. So I think a good word, you said they want to do it, right? So consent. The person who is involved in human smuggling would be consenting to being smuggled. Now, there may be a point in time where either they did not consent in the first place, and then it probably is a case of trafficking, or maybe they consented at the beginning, but then the people that they're with turn out to be dangerous, or things go kind of sideways and they don't want to be there anymore. So if they are then being abused sexually, or if they are being sold, it would be, they're then the victims of a crime, either maybe sexual assault or trafficking. Or they might be, being taken and being labor trafficked. But a lot of times people kind of use human smuggling and human trafficking willy-nilly, and they don't really distinguish between the two. Something to keep in mind is that for trafficking, you actually don't have to be transported anywhere. There are, unfortunately, also, let me pause really quickly. If this topic ever becomes too heavy for you, please feel free to take a break, because I know this is a really, really difficult topic. But there are actually kids who have been trafficked by their family, right? And they may never leave their home. So transportation is not necessary. A crossing of borders is not necessary. And a lot of trafficking victims are, especially domestic minors, or are legal citizens or legal residents. So that is kind of a difference. Whereas if you are engaged in human smuggling, there's going to be a crossing of a border, so on and so forth. So has anyone heard of the Polaris Hotline? I see some nods. So this is a national hotline, and they take phone calls from anyone who has a concern about human trafficking. Either they may feel like a family member or a friend is being trafficked, they may have suspicions about a business, or a person, they will field all of those calls. They keep track of them, and they also give them all over to law enforcement. So if you call the human trafficking hotline, law enforcement will see that phone call. But you can make the call anonymously. We always recommend calling, especially if it's an emergency, calling the HPD human trafficking vice line as well. But this also gives us some good data. So since 2007, there have been 15,000 calls in Texas to the Polaris hotline. Now, something I want to note is that a lot of times people will use the number of hotline calls to kind of as a proxy for the amount of human trafficking that's occurring in a particular state. Why do you think that might not be such a good idea?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
So if you're using the number of calls as a to indicate how much trafficking is occurring.
Oh, okay.
Because those are just the ones that are reported.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole bunch that aren't reported.
Absolutely. Anyone else have an idea? Yeah?
Or the ones that do call in, they might not be accurate.
Yes, well, that's always a problem. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we've only had this word for 20 years, right, or this term. And also, I think more and more we're starting to hear about it, right? So with awareness, you're also going to see a hike in phone calls. Awareness is good. So you kind of have to balance that. People are going to notice things more with also, these numbers are higher than we want them to be because we don't want this level of occurrence. So to your point about, you don't know how accurate the information is, they have identified from these calls, they have indicators that they believe, if it's a trafficking case, they're very likely to have these numbers of indicators. And they categorize it low, moderate, and high. So if there are a high number of indicators, they believe it's very likely to be a case of human trafficking. Moderate, it's likely to be a case. Low, may be a case. Does that make sense? So about 6,500 cases with high indicators and just over 7,000 with moderate indicators. This also includes when victims or survivors call in, because they may actually be calling in to ask for help for themselves. This is a study out of UT. They are estimating that there are about 80,000 minor and youth sex trafficking victims in Texas. So that's going to be obviously minors, but then also extending up into, I believe, 20. And then just under 235,000 labor trafficking victims. So that gives you an idea of just how many more labor trafficking victims there are. That's including children and adults, though. So this is a really, really interesting study. Vanessa Boucher is the researcher that did this study on illicit massage businesses in Houston. Does anyone know kind of what an illicit massage business is? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Say what?
Yes.
So basically you go to they're offering a massage, but instead they're selling sex. It's a front for prostitution and human trafficking.
Nail shops do that too.
Yeah, yes, unfortunately. So these numbers are probably a little bit lower because they're not including like nail salons and different types of spas. But we do several counts a year, and we usually find that there are around like just under 300 illicit massage businesses in Houston. Our CEO likes to cite that there are more illicit massage businesses than Starbucks in the city, which is true. And actually it's true nationwide because there are just over 9,000 illicit massage businesses across the nation, and there are just over 8,000 Starbucks. But in Houston, this researcher estimated that there were 2,869 customers a day at these illicit massage businesses, and an annual gross revenue of about 107 million. I'll tell you a little bit more about these illicit massage businesses, but for the most part, you're not going to, like if you were to just walk in, if you were to be mistaken, and think it's a regular massage business, for the most part, you're going to be turned away. They're just going to say, like, we're busy, there's no one available right now. So now I want to talk a little bit about recruitment and grooming, and kind of going into domestic minor sex trafficking. So there are recruitment locations, both physical and on the internet. Something that every time I have a group of parents that they want to know about is the internet and social media and what's out there. And unfortunately, that's constantly changing, right? So while a lot of times back in the day, you know, maybe bus stops, train stops, malls, parks, and that still does exist, now we're seeing more and more and more, especially minors, being approached by traffickers on the internet. They're going to identify and exploit vulnerabilities. I was in a training once, and the trainer was talking about an interview with a trafficker, and he said that when he was kind of getting a feel for whether he was going to approach a girl, he would try to make eye contact with her. And if she held his gaze, okay, I'm going to move on. If she immediately looked down, okay, maybe I'll approach her, because he's kind of looking for, like, does she seem a little unsure of herself? That they're going to look for kids who have a certain need that they're going to be able to fill. Be that, you know, love, self-esteem, stability, different things. And then assert and maintain control. So this will often look a little bit like a domestic violence type of situation, and there's a lot of comorbidity between the two. But, you know, what might be started out as a very, you know, being swept off your feet relationship is going to turn into something that's more manipulative, darker, and then oftentimes, you know, violence involved as well. Let's go with that. So I like to always talk about labor trafficking. I'll just talk about it really briefly. There are a number of industries. Let me see. Yeah, I have the slide. So everything from, you know, agriculture, construction, any kind of like domestic servitude, cosmetology, all of those industries, there are plenty of cases and plenty of instances of labor trafficking. And in some cases, there may be overlap between labor trafficking and sex trafficking. For example, in the illicit massage businesses, something that's really unfortunate is that for most labor trafficking victims, they may be able to get back wages, and with those back wages, you know, they can really start over again, kind of gives them their very deserved second chance. But if you are also a victim of sex trafficking, a lot of times it's difficult to make the case for back wages, because if you are involved even as a victim in illicit work, you can't claim wages for that. So establishing how much of the time you were doing something legitimate like massaging versus sex, etc. So that's just one more kind of impediment for those victims. This is a very, very high profile case, and I will say one of the more black and white labor trafficking cases, but there is obviously more people are vulnerable after a natural disaster, and there's also a lot of construction and quick work that needs to happen after a natural disaster. So labor trafficking does occur more oftentimes after a big disaster. So after Hurricane Katrina, there was a company that brought over a number of Indian nationals. They put them in I don't know if everyone can see, but these are trailers, and they had 24 men per trailer in these bunk beds. They were armed guards outside. They took their passports, all their documents, and then they were forced them to pay $1,000 and $1,050 in rent and board. So they were basically making nothing, which is of course ridiculous rent to share a trailer with 24 other people. And, you know, they could leave, they just have to get past the armed guard outside, right? So they actually received a huge settlement. After Harvey, we worked with the city to pass out a lot of information for those who were working to fix a lot of the construction houses, different things that have been damaged after the hurricane. So they kind of know their rights. Okay, going back to domestic minor sex trafficking. So domestic minors are the single largest group vulnerable to trafficking. And a lot of times, we associate this with something that is either happening in another country or is happening to people that have been brought in from other countries. But in fact, a lot of American children are being trafficked. It's happening in our cities, in our neighborhoods. And then a life of prostitution often begins as a minor. So we are Children at Risk, right? We are an organization that serves children, but within the human trafficking team, we don't really make a distinction between whether our legislation or whether our research just affects children, because so many children may become trafficked as 15, 14-year-old, but they may not come to kind of be in the system until they are an adult. And I'll talk about some reasons why that's so. So who is at high risk? Basically, a lot of the kids that may not have a really stable home life, for one. So this is, I just wanted to say, this is the kids that are at the highest risk, right? Trafficking has occurred in every type of neighborhood, city, etc. But these are the kids that you're going to see most often as trafficking victims. So kids who are running away, homeless, that's definitely going to expose them almost immediately to traffickers. Kids who may have been abused, neglected, physically as well as sexually abused. Kids who may have had gone into foster care, and all of these are going to be correlated, right? If you are in foster care, you have probably been abused or neglected. And then because a trafficker is going to put as much risk as possible on the victim and does not want to take any of that risk on for himself, they may also be involved in other crimes like carrying drugs for him. So you'll also see a lot of these kids have some kind of involvement with the juvenile justice system. Low self-esteem, mental health issues, substance abuse. Again, a lot of these are going to be kind of interrelated. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg, because substance abuse is something that some traffickers use to either groom or keep their victim very pliable. And then exposure to the sex trade. One note I want to make about this is that while it is a risk factor for becoming a victim of human trafficking, it is also a risk factor for someone becoming a trafficker. So these are all things that we just don't want kids to experience, right? With, decreasing levels of child abuse, decreasing levels of child neglect, decreasing, instability in a child's home, or moving around a lot, different things. If we work on preventing all of that, we'll also prevent a lot of cases of child trafficking. One other thing I want to note is that a lot of these things are also correlated with a child moving around a lot. And if you think about it, there's going to be no one kind of persistent in that child's life except maybe their parents or a guardian. But aside from that, there's not going to be someone at school that sees that a child went from a straight-A kid to suddenly having behavioral issues. They're just going to move to new school and have behavioral issues and be that kid who has behavioral issues. They don't have that consistent social support. And then the trafficker comes in and tries to provide that, right? We kind of talked about this. Oh, one thing I wanted to note, foster homes and residential treatment centers. There are a few things that I thought were urban myths before I started this work, and I'd heard that traffickers will hang out on the outskirts of residential treatment centers and whatnot, and I thought that was kind of like a tall tale. But having spoken to people who work in the foster care system and people who work in residential treatment centers, multiple people who work in these places every day have confirmed that does indeed happen all the time. That if there's a park close by or something like that, there will be someone kind of waiting for people who are running away or have their insurance has run out or something like that. And this is an adult case, but in fact, there is a really interesting little documentary on, I can't remember what channel it was, but it was a man who would write into women in adult prisons who were going to be released soon. And they basically give you, I think it's like $40, but you have to have someone there to pick you up. The ones who, maybe they didn't have someone, they didn't have a great relationship with their family, whatever, he would offer to pick them up, take them straight to his home, and then start abusing them and trafficking them. So they're just looking for those people who need someone, right, and are very vulnerable. So there's finesse pimping, Romeo pimping, it's sometimes called, and I'm kind of using pimping as a synonym for trafficking, right? But this is where something starts off as a relationship. So for most minors and adults, for that matter, it's not a case of kidnapping. In the I was walking down the street and I got snatched off the street by a stranger. Most minors know their trafficker in some capacity. And then a lot of times it may be an older boyfriend, it may be a relationship. So they're starting this off as a Romeo, making promises. One trafficker that I spoke on a panel with, she went to a new school. She was very shy. Some older, very cool girls befriended her and then introduced her to an older guy. This older guy took her out to dinners, bought her nice gifts, all these things. And then, about 2 weeks in, a month in, he says, "You didn't think all of that was free, right?" At a party. And he's like, "Go have sex with this guy," or "I know where your parents live. I'll hurt you and your family." So, she was being trafficked most days after school, and then she would go home. And she was also being sexually abused at home, unfortunately. So that wasn't really a safe place for her to make an outcry. And it also established a very messed up model of what love should look like, right? A lot of these kids don't have a great, model of that in their life already. So this finesse, that's more of the fraud, maybe the coercion, that oftentimes turns into a more violent form of trafficking as well. Like I said, you can kind of think of domestic violence as kind of almost a part of these relationships. But that also means that it's very, very difficult for a lot of these victims to make an outcry or to identify as victims. Another thing that was brought up in one of these trainings was, if you go and you talk to a child and you say, "Hey, tell me about your trafficker," they're like, "What? What are you talking about? You mean my boyfriend? No, that's my boyfriend. Yes, I'm 15, he's 35, but you don't understand our love." That kind of thing, And even as adults, especially if they've been with this person for a number of years, they may feel like, well, I don't like this, I don't want to be doing this, but if we just get enough money, I won't have to do this anymore, and then we can be married and we can, have kids and it'll be great. So they feel oftentimes very conflicted, actually, about their trafficker. That also, that's kind of a byproduct of trauma bonds. I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard of Stockholm Syndrome, which is kind of a form of these trauma bonds, but this is going to be a much more deeply ingrained version of that, right? Because they're probably spending a ton of time, if not living, with their trafficker. And although they are responsible for a lot of the bad things that happen, they also are the ones that then remove the bad thing that hurts, right? So it becomes this very messy, messed up relationship where there might be actually a lot of attachment there, unfortunately. So some red flags. certain tattoos, and I'll try to actually walk around the room and show you examples of these tattoos. So barcode tattoos, or kind of like ownership tattoos, multiple motel room keys, multiple phones. Definitely if a minor has multiple hotel room keys, I would hope that would set off a lot of alarms. When I have been speaking to younger people, what I hear a lot of times, if they do kind of have a story where they feel like a friend or someone they knew was being trafficked, they almost always talk about expensive gifts coming from someone older. And then, you know, a lot of someone that's very, very controlling, they're controlling their speech and their movements. And for behavioral, a lot of anxiety, a lot of sleep issues, you know, trauma, shame, isolation, truancy, running away, missing school, change in school performance. So I was just going to kind of show everyone, these are some examples of real life tattoos that have been found on victims. So you can see the barcode. I really liked, you know, the treating someone as a commodity, your mind to buy and sell. And then you have these very paternalistic, you know, daddy's girl, or, you know, their name tattooed on the person. So we've also worked actually with tattoo artists and tattoo removal professionals, because as you can imagine, this is actually pretty traumatic, especially if it's in a place that's very visible to the victim. They have to continue to see this, right? But also for tattoo artists, they have, they are a potential early identifier of a victim. Okay, so social media and cyber safety. This is what a lot of parents especially are interested in. So we still have Facebook up there. I don't think one under the age of 25 is using Facebook anymore. I don't know. You are? Okay. I'm also on Facebook, but I'm not under 25. So Instagram, Snapchat, but even things like TikTok and Twitch, traffickers have been using to get into contact with kids. One of my colleagues, her daughter has a private Instagram, just a picture of her face, and there's no other details on it. And someone direct messaged her offering to manage her, basically, AKA a trafficker. She's a teenager. Oh, I'm so sorry. Going back, I know I've been talking about force, fraud, or coercion. If you are under 18, you don't need any of those elements. If someone is receiving something for you having sex with someone else, that is enough. So if you are 15 years old and you have this boyfriend and he asks you to perform a sexual favor with someone else and they get some kind of benefit from that, that's it. Even if you wanted to do it, whatever, you can't consent to something like that. So under 18, it's, you know, you don't need to have those extra 3 elements. Sorry. And then also, you know, on these social media sites, a lot of times traffickers are kind of looking for pretty like normal teenage angsty language, like, you know, no one understands me, I'm so frustrated with my parents, blah, blah, blah. But they're going to kind of stoke those fires of resentment, and they're going to try to isolate the child. They're going to, you know, get them into their world and distance them from other people, their existing support system if they have one. Another victim story, I like to include a lot of real life victim stories in my presentation. She was, you know, normal teenage girl. Someone added her on Snapchat, and I don't even know if she ever met them in person, but she kind of talked to them, maybe hung out in a group once or twice. And then when she was at a party, her friends ended up drinking, the people she was supposed to go home with. She didn't want her parents to know she was at the party, so she sent a message out on Snapchat, hey, can anyone pick me up? This person picked her up and never took her home, and then trafficked her for a number of months. So that's kind of an example. But he had already been grooming her and kind of establishing, kind of isolating her for a number of months before that even happened. I don't think anyone's going to be able to see this video. It's a little funny and a little cruel, to be honest, but I wanted to share it with you. Basically, parents get this guy to pose as a teenage boy on, I think it's Snapchat is what they're using, and they want to see if their daughters will meet up with a stranger. And in these cases, they do, and then their parents pop out. One girl just immediately starts sobbing. So it's a little bit mean, but they're kind of like trying to see what their kids will actually do. This is, I don't know if you can see, strangers trying to talk to me on social media, me keeping them out of my DMs. And then, so we have had, from time to time, a chat bot. One of the chat bots that we had, has anyone heard of the website Backpage? Backpage? So it was like a Craigslist, but basically they made all of their money off of people selling sex. It was shut down about 2 years ago, but we would post fake ads on it. And then when someone would text the ad to try to buy sex, we would the chatbot would talk back and forth with them a little bit, and then send them a website that has a lot of information. This Backpage, a number of minors were posted on Backpage. It was often very difficult, even after they were recovered by their parents and proven to be minors. Backpage would take a long time to take their ads down, even though a lot of times there was very explicit material in those ads. They also would scrape ads that had indicators that the person was a minor, kind of like coded language, such as Lolita. They would actually take those words out and then still post the ad. And then they ended up giving people a list of terms that they couldn't use, which is kind of like giving a criminal a cheat sheet. Like it's not actually decreasing trafficking, right? As well as a number of adult victims could also be trafficked on those sites, right? But these are just some examples because not only did Johns text us to try to buy sex, or buyers, we also got texts from traffickers. So come make your mess move with King YB. I know you're tired of the lame bum situation. Ain't seeing no progress, so what you hoeing for? Bitch, you need credential. Which, never mind. I got that mixed up with prudential, and so for a second I thought they were talking about insurance, and I was like really confused. And then, hey, I have a condo, I have a nice car, come with me, you can improve your situation, those kinds of messages. So the underground commercial sex economy, these are actually two examples. This is an illicit cantina, and then this is an illicit massage business.
Is the cantina in Houston?
Yes.
That was not too long ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of the biggest human trafficking busts that have happened nationwide have been in Houston. So we did a map of suspected illicit massage businesses in the county, and we actually use a website that is kind of the Yelp of illicit massage businesses, basically. So guys will go on and talk about and kind of rate providers and businesses and talk about, passwords and all these different things. Yeah, your face is like how I feel every time I have to read it. But we also mapped out how close a lot of these businesses were to public schools. So 35,000 Texas children attend school within 1,000 feet of an illicit massage business, and just under 1 million attend school within a mile. I will caveat this by saying for illicit massage businesses, it is mostly adult women of East Asian descent. who are the victims in these businesses. So it's not that these businesses are going to like kidnap your kid or something like that, or kidnap you, but I think it normalizes it a lot for kids, right? Everyone, I'm sure kids kind of know what is the sketchy massage business, and then they make jokes about it, and it becomes something that's funny instead of, there are actually really, really terrible atrocities happening in this area. They're also usually cash-only businesses, and that attracts all kinds of crime. And then it also is just a good way to get people interested. Everyone wants to know, like, okay, in my school district, where are these businesses? And it gets people to look at the map and kind of get a feeling. In Houston, it's actually a lot of times near really nice neighborhoods, and it's more along the west side, especially the energy corridor, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because you're also going to have a lot of male workers there. One other note. I live in the Heights, and so of course I looked in my neighborhood, right? And then I read some of the reviews, and first of all, the business that I was looking at was like 2 blocks from my mother-in-law's house, and I definitely had almost gone in there one time with my husband because I just didn't think anything of it. It looked fairly normal. And then as I'm reading the review, I realized it is also across the street from a daycare. And there is a review of a man saying that he had to drop his girlfriend's son off at daycare, and then before he picked him up again, he was like, oh, I'll make this quick trip to the massage business, and he was mad because he had to rush to then pick up the little boy. And then 16,000 plus in Harris County attend school within 1,000 feet of an illicit massage business. This is it's Yoda and then Baby Yoda. Prostitution is a victimless crime, and Baby Yoda says, "Okay, boomer." So, and I actually want to back up before we talk about demand and talk about cantinas for a second. So illicit cantinas, like I said, in Houston have been some of the biggest human trafficking busts that have occurred nationwide. There is a very, very famous one. So a grandmother was actually the kind of queenpin of a huge trafficking organization, and she was trafficking women out of her cantina. She made about $1.8 million completely untaxed, just off of the room fee and condom fee, I believe. And for these illicit cantinas, a lot of the women were being forced to drink up to like 40, 50 beers a night, because part of the process is that you go in and you buy a beer for, $15. And then, you maybe buy enough beers, and then you get to go. The girls and women were living on the premises in absolutely squalid conditions. Girls as young as 14 were recovered on the site, and they were, had no control over their movement, were being forced to have sex with a lot of men a day, as you can probably imagine from the amount of money she was making. She's also dodging taxes, right? So we think that's a good opportunity to get different organizations involved that might not be naturally thinking about human trafficking. But more importantly, she and a bunch of members of her family were doing just unspeakable horrors to girls and young women. And she was a 73-year-old grandmother. Her daughters and other family members were involved in the business, and that's just one example of a cantina case. So now I wanted to talk really quickly about the commercial sex economy. So something that we don't think is covered enough is stopping the demand for human trafficking and exploitative commercial sex. Going after the traffickers is really, really difficult, and although we want it to happen more and more, they are going to be putting the victim's face on the internet. They put the victim on the street. They force the victim, there have been victims that have to take out fraudulent loans. You know, their credit is ruined. They might be charged with all kinds of charges that you wouldn't even think of, and the trafficker is just going to hide behind all of that. It's also complicated by the fact that the victim is going to either be in love with their trafficker or terrified of their trafficker or some mixture of both. So it's just very, very difficult to make these cases against traffickers, especially when there's not a lot of precedent and these traffickers are getting out very quickly. So, you know, if you have a terrified witness, they need to know this trafficker is going away for a long time. So that brings me to why we really believe in stopping the demand, because without the demand for exploitative sex, human trafficking, there would be no trafficking, right? There would just be no money to be made in it, and no one would do it. So an example of, you know, we believe that so without, there can still be exploitative sex, there can still be a victim without a trafficker, but there can't be exploitation without a buyer. And the example that I'll give for that is especially someone who, maybe someone's aging out of foster care, right? And they are, you know, trying to find an apartment at 18. I'm sure a lot of you know how difficult it is to find a job, find housing at 18. They may have very, very little support, and they may engage in survival sex. That's still exploitation. I believe that that's not okay, and it's not really consent in the sense that they would be doing this if they had other options. And to me, that buyer is still exploiting them and engaging in sex that's not really truly being given with consent, right? So I think there are some people who have just never thought about it this way, and they may think, hey, I'm helping this person out, right? I'm giving them money. Well, you could just give them money, right? And actually knowing a lot of the history and the stories behind what put someone in this position, or the actual, you know, story of their trafficking where they did not at all make any choices that would put them in this position. Hopefully they would, if they knew that, they would not buy this person and continue to go through with that. There are some people who that would not matter to, and then we want to make sure that police are arresting those buyers. It's a lot more difficult to arrest buyers than it is to arrest sellers, but sellers are going to be the people that are on the street saying, you know, soliciting. They may be victims, right? And those victims are not going to be particularly responsive to deterrence if they're being trafficked, or if, you know, they need to do this for to put food on the table, etc. Buyers, on the other hand, will be responsive to deterrence. They will be responsive to the threat of arrest because they have the power to make a different choice. So with that being said, we worked on some legislation. It's kind of a play on the Nordic model. I don't know if any of you have heard about the Nordic model, but it's increasing penalties for buyers. We'd love to decrease penalties for sellers, but that's a hard task in Texas. But we moved up before. It was not it was a misdemeanor until your fourth offense as a buyer, and almost no buyers are getting arrested 4 times because it's much easier to arrest sellers, right? Now it is a state jail felony on your second offense. So that's still actually going to affect very few buyers, but there's that threat out there of if you get caught for this twice, you have a felony on your record. That also motivates prosecutors to not drop a lot of these cases that they were dropping against buyers before, whereas they weren't dropping the cases against sellers because a lot of them had, you know, prior convictions and or very little money for any kind of representation. So what can you do? It's a BoJack Horseman, I'm so overwhelmed. Any ideas of what you can do to help the fight? Y'all are like, tell me what to do. So first of all, Children at Risk is a research and advocacy organization. So we are really, really involved in putting together legislation, finding advocates and sponsors for that legislation, and then supporting it through the process. We love to hear from y'all, from the public, and we love support from the public on any of our bills. So as you probably know, legislative session is every other year. So not this year, but the next. And we will have a slate of bills. We encourage, if you know any survivors, we love to have them testify to the Senate, the House on these bills. You can help by calling, you can help by writing in, and you can help by, if you have ideas, emailing me, and we can actually, maybe put your idea to paper and turn it into a bill. The other thing is, actually talking about this in your community. So a big part of stopping demand is changing the culture. There is the threat of arrest, there is stronger laws, but a lot of it is just us changing how we think about other human beings and whether we're going to treat them as a commodity. So talking to your friends and kind of spreading this message is a big part of that change. And I think a lot of, like the Me Too movement and different conversations that we're now having, it's a really good time to make that shift in how we think about people. Also, if you know people who own small businesses, a lot of former victims, survivors, they have a record and it's very difficult for them to get jobs. So being open to offering them a job, lots of different things. You could, in your classes, take things on as a project. There's always more research that needs to be done around human trafficking. So these are just some ideas. I don't know if now I've sparked any other ideas. Feel free to interrupt me, because I always enjoy when I'm presenting and other people have ideas that I can then regurgitate to more groups. And then just some safety tips. If you do find yourself in a situation where you think someone might be a victim, don't approach the trafficker, don't get involved. You may actually make things worse for the victim if you try to approach or interfere, because they may not go with you because they are probably attached to that person in some way. They may go home with the trafficker, and then the trafficker may hurt them because you said something. So that being said, let's say a friend comes to you and they're confiding in you. Make a report. You're not the police, so you would call the police at that point. You're not the police, so you don't need to make them tell you everything. You're just there to kind of be a listening ear and be supportive and make sure that they're in a safe space. And then you also, if you have kind of a suspicion but you're not sure, that's a really great time to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, because they'll keep track of the number of people. Say there's a business that kind of seems off but you can't put your finger on it. You could report that to them, and let's say they've had 250 reports. That tells them something. So I encourage all of you to put this number into your phone if you don't already have it. It's 1-800-3737-888, and that's the National Human Trafficking Hotline. That's the number that you can call if you have some kind of suspicion and you'd like to make a report. You can also call Crime Stoppers. Also, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and then most importantly, you can call the Human Trafficking Unit in HPD, and that number is 713-308-8600. For all of these numbers, you can report anonymously. So. Just one more quick note, and this is about advocacy. So these are just some tips if you do want to get involved in state advocacy. be prepared, kind of know the topic before you go, but you can actually make in-person visits, especially as a class or as a group. That's a great thing to do. You probably won't meet with your legislator. They'll probably have you meet with a staffer, but that's actually in some ways better because the staffers are the ones who are getting more in depth on a particular topic. If you can't make a personal visit, letters, phone calls, emails, kind of in that order, are also effective. And then you can actually apply to give public testimony. So I think I think a lot of younger people feel sometimes a little bit out of control of what's happening, at the state or national level politically. But you actually can do more, I think, than you think. And then this is my contact information, as well as our senior staff attorney and our senior law fellow. So Caroline Roberts, you can email me at croberts@childrenatrisk.org, or come and get a business card afterwards. Ask me any questions, totally free for the next 15, 20 minutes to talk to y'all. So any questions before I close? Yes.
Do you find that victims of trafficking, like within the judicial system, are charged with crimes for smuggling?
No, not usually. I think it is very, very difficult to get a T visa. So if you were not a citizen and you're a victim of trafficking, you would probably apply for a T visa or a U visa because you have certain rights, and you're then going to be seen as a victim, even if you may have done some things that weren't so great at the beginning. But it might affect your T visa application rather than you being charged with something. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. And in general, getting a visa is kind of a nightmare. Any other questions? That's a really good question. Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.